I'm going to show you how to make REST API calls to Aria Automation. Let's get started.
Hi everyone, I'm Watrous from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you're in the right place.
This is part 9 in a 10-part video series in which we're exploring how to make REST API calls. In parts 1 through 8, we took a generic look at how to make REST API calls. But now, in parts 9 and onwards, we're going to take a look at specific VMware products. In part 9, we're going to be taking a look at how to make REST API calls to VMware Aria Automation.
All right, we're going to do something really cool in this video. In this video, we are going to do a deployment from a VRA blueprint through the REST API. Ready? Let's do this. All right, you'll recall in the previous video, we saw how to do a test of a blueprint. And one of the key things that we need to do a test was our body had to specify the blueprint ID. The same thing is true when you do an actual deployment. So if you look at this REST request, it essentially looks like the previous one with one tiny difference. They are identical in terms of the URL. They are identical, almost entirely identical in terms of the body. So just like test blueprint needed the blueprint ID, here once again we need the blueprint ID. The thing that makes this test blueprint request behave a little differently than the deploy blueprint request is on line number 10. Simulate : false means I don't want to do a simulation. I don't want to test the blueprint. I don't want to validate the blueprint. I want to actually do a deployment from the blueprint. So again, deploy blueprint. To do a deployment from a blueprint, you're going to say simulate false. On the other hand, if you're doing a test of a blueprint, you say simulate : true. But otherwise, these two operations behave essentially the same way. So we're going to run this REST request. Just to make certain here, I want to make certain that the blueprint that gets used in this case is this one called VVork-CentOS. And we can see up here in the URL that the blueprint ID ends in 5613. So let's make certain that our blueprint _ID environment variable which is right here, is in fact 5613. So that's the right blueprint. We're just about ready to click the send button and actually do a deployment by using the REST API, but there's one little tweak that I'm going to make on this deployment. In this video and the next two, we're going to be doing 3 separate deployments, and each deployment needs to have its own name. When we use the broken blueprint here shortly, the deployment name is going to end in -broken. When we use the one that has inputs, we're going to change this to -inputs. For this first deployment, I'm just going to set the deployment name to CentOS VM from API. So let's go ahead and hit send and see what happens here. Well, just like we saw in a test, we get information about this request that we've just kicked off, including we can see that the request has been started. Now, just like when we did a test, be aware that status here is talking about the request that we just sent via the REST API. It's not talking about what's going on in VRA, but rather the request that we sent. That was kicked off asynchronously. It's running in the background on the VRA server, but if we want to know what's actually going on with that request, we're going to need to work with that, where is it hiding, request tracker ID that we talked about in the previous video. So using the request tracker ID for this deployment that we're doing, I'm going to go to our get status of blueprint request that we talked about in the previous video. I'm going to run this, and notice it gives us all sorts of information, including down here on the bottom. This status is telling us the status of the deployment in VRA. So I can see that in VRA, a deployment has been started. It's not done yet. If it was done and succeeded, it would say finished here. If it was done and the deployment failed, it would say failed here. That's not what this says. This says status : started, which means the job has been kicked off in VRA, but it's not done yet. So let's go take a look in VRA and see what's going on. Over in VRA, if we go to resources deployments, we don't see anything here. The reason why we don't see the deployment here is because the GUI did not kick off the deployment. We kicked off the deployment using the REST API behind the GUI's back. If the GUI had submitted the deployment, it would know to automatically refresh the screen to show us what's going on with the deployment. So as you work with the REST API and you do things like deployments, if you don't see the deployment, you can simply refresh the screen, or if you go to another screen, come back to the screen. One way or another, you need to prod it to refresh. So I'm going to click the refresh button here. And as you can see, here is my job. It's in progress. And it's going to take a little while, so why don't we stare at the screen? Tell you what, I'll speed up the video and we'll see what happens when this is done. As you can see, our deployment request has completed. We can see that here in the GUI, but how would we know that the deployment was done if we're using the REST API? Well, you actually already know the answer to that. Let's go back to Postman, and you'll recall we just ran get status of blueprint request, and it said it was started, but watch what happens when I click send and get another update on the status of that request. So let's click send in 3, 2, 1. So notice now, this is the same request. The request to do the deployment now says finished because the job completed successfully. All right. Give yourself a pat on the back because you now know how to do deployments from blueprints via the REST API. And admittedly, in this example, our blueprint is pretty straightforward. All our blueprint does, let's go take a look at it. We were using this blueprint. All our blueprint is doing is deploying a machine and plugging it into network. But you could pick any blueprint with all sorts of crazy complex resources, maybe a blueprint with multiple machines and load balancers and multiple networks and disks and security groups and so forth. No matter how complex the blueprint is here in VRA, you're going to be able to do deployments via the REST API. You'll recall that the body gave information about the deployment we wanted to do, including the blueprint ID, the name of the deployment, and so forth. I'd just like to remind you that the blueprint that we used, VMW-CentOS, does not have any inputs. To prove that, we'll go over to the blueprint. It has no inputs. So even though we've kindly supplied some inputs in this REST request body, they were completely ignored by the VRA blueprint. Again, we're going to see lines 11 through 14 come in handy 2 videos from now when we look at a blueprint that does require inputs.
Join me in the next video and we'll continue looking at the Aria Automation API.